This is the story of an office worker who in his previous life went to work every day on crowded trains and always returned home on the last train. It was a monotonous life that came to an end when he reincarnated into another world and became the lord of a remote village. He resolved to change, declaring that he would use this power to make the village prosper. He awakens in a room and notices his new appearance. He gets out of bed and looks out the window. Upon seeing a completely different world, he wonders where he is. At that moment, a maid warns him to be careful. He apologizes and explains that he lost his breath because the view was so overwhelming. Hearing such advanced words surprises the maid, since he is only 2 years old and those expressions are far too complex for a child his age. The young boy becomes even more confused. As he looks around, he states that although he does not understand why, he remembers having lived in this place before. In his mind, he concludes that he has experienced reincarnation. He then asks if the maid's name is Till and if she serves him here, which she confirms. He also asks if his own name is Van Nefertio, revealing the identity of the young protagonist. The maid praises him for being able to pronounce his family name correctly. Van then begins listing the names of his family members, his father Halpa and his siblings Mercia, Har and Sexto. Till praises him for each name he mentions. Afterward, Van asks where they are currently located. In the next scene, the entire family is shown seated at the table. Here the father is introduced as the Marquis and head of the family, Jalpabula Tifertoo. This is followed by the eldest son, Mercia Lago Fertio, then the second son, Hargo Fertio, and finally the third son, Sexto El Ferto. Naturally, the fourth child is the protagonist himself, who meets even more servants assigned to him. While being carefully attended to, Van feels as if he is some kind of honored guest at a cabaret. To him it feels like extreme luxury. Putting jokes aside, he clearly realizes that he has reincarnated into another world while retaining his memories. Soon after, his father begins to speak. He asks Har what he will study that day, and Har, still nervous, answers that he will study fire magic and military formations. His father then asks the next son, who responds that he will study magic. Finally, the question reaches the protagonist. Van answers that since there is still so much he does not know, he will begin by studying the culture and history of the nation. Hearing this, his brothers are shocked, as he is only 2 years old. His father laughs in relief and remarks that his youngest son was not as poorly raised as he had feared. He declares that Van undoubtedly inherited his powerful fire magic, ensuring the future of the family. The father then looks at Van closely and says that he is looking forward to his magical aptitude test at the age of 8. Van explains that in this world, magical aptitude is essential. Nobles are required to master offensive elements in order to protect the people: fire, water, wind, and earth. Those who possess aptitude for other elements are considered a disgrace. He adds that his father and brothers possess aptitude for all 4 elements. Later, while alone in his study room, Van examines a map and asks Till about the creatures of this world. He asks whether there are many races, and Till replies that there is a great variety, including elves and dwarves. At that moment, another maid notices that Till has been discussing very complex topics. Realizing her mistake, Till apologizes, but Van reassures her, explaining that he asks these questions because he wants to learn everything. He then requests more information about magical artifacts. Till explains that they consist of magic crystals and certain gems. She adds that stones and minerals can store magical energy, and magical objects can be created from them according to one's magical aptitude. Seeing how attentively Van listens, the other maids begin calling him a child prodigy. Suddenly, an elderly man arrives and places several books on the desk. Van reacts with an expression that suggests disbelief at being given books at only 2 years old. The man explains that although Van is still young and learning only the basics, he wants to evaluate how much he remembers. Van then introduces the man as Esparta, the head butler, and his father's loyal servant for decades. Van explains to the butler that he still does not know much about written characters. Esparta then asks him about numbers. Van answers that he knows a little about addition and subtraction. In that case, Esparta asks how many fingers 3 fingers plus 2 fingers make, and Van answers correctly. For those who found it difficult, the answer is 5. The entire room falls silent for a few seconds. The old man approaches the desk and declares that from that moment on he will personally take charge of Van's education. Thus, a living hell begins for Van. He spends weeks and weeks studying, but the effort produces good results. In a short time he learns how to read and write, and after 2 long years of study he turns 4 years old. Van is then shown training with a sword. His instructor is none other than the maid Till, who easily dodges all of Van's attacks. She even has time to dance around him, causing Van to collapse on the ground from exhaustion. Till boasts about defeating young Master Van once again, while Van gets back up in frustration after losing, and chases after her trying to strike her. He is stopped by the other maids. They warn Till that she is risking both her life and her job by mocking a noble. 2 other maids ask the young master to punish her for her insolence. Van states that there is no need to punish her since they were only playing. However, Till is already being tightly restrained and begins crying. Another maid scolds Till and tells Van that he cannot let this go, as disrespect toward a noble is a very serious crime. Till cries desperately, begging not to be punished. Van then approaches her and lightly flicks her on the forehead, declaring the matter settled. The maids protest that this is not a sufficient punishment, but Van insists that it is resolved, leaving Till with a relieved smile. Van explains that he practices swordsmanship every day. After 1 year, when he turns 5 years old, he is already able to fight on equal footing with older military children. He is shown facing another child armed with a sword and shield. Van notes that when fighting only children, their attacks are easy to predict. He dodges a frontal strike and then forcefully hits the shield, knocking the other child to the ground, and clearly showing the vast difference in experience. The rest of the children watch in amazement, saying that young Master Van is impressive. They admire his talent with the sword and even call him a sword prodigy. Van, acting like the courteous gentleman he is, helps the other boy back to his feet and asks if he is all right. This earns him even more admiration from the children. They comment that Van speaks to people like them, unlike other young nobles, and describe him as a very unusual person. After this, Van goes to take a break, when his guard calls out to him. The man is D, the vice commander of the knights. Van asks what is wrong and D asks to see his hands. Upon examining them, D is surprised to find no calluses and that Van's skin remains very smooth. He assumes Van must also be training at night. Van replies that he does not, as his studies already exhaust him. D then tells him about a rumor, saying that Sparta wants Van to study 3 times more than the others. This shocks Van, and he realizes that this explains why he has been studying all day while no one else does. Taking advantage of the moment, D offers to speak with Sparta so that Van can spend more time practicing swordsmanship with him. He remarks that Sparta is extremely stubborn and obsessed with books. He then adds that Van should dedicate himself to the art of the sword, and that he will make him the greatest swordsman in the kingdom. Van is momentarily stunned by the passion in D's words, and can tell that he is completely serious. He replies that he enjoys swordsmanship but also likes studying, so he intends to work hard at both. D respects his decision but asks to personally continue training him with the sword. Van only asks that he go easy on him. D assures him that he will, since Van is still a child, striking a pose and laughing in his face, which makes Van realize that he is clearly lying. The sword training that follows is extremely intense. D suddenly appears like a force from the heavens, demonstrating powerful sword techniques while ordering Van to perform 100 high strikes, 100 mid-level strikes, 100 upward attacks, and many more, all without rest. Despite Van being only 5 years old, they continue like this throughout the entire morning and afternoon. Van calls him a demon, while D comes up with another idea, saying that resting while sitting would only cause boredom. Instead, he recommends resting in a guard stance. Van concludes that D is not a demon, but simply a massive idiot, though he is shocked to see that this idiot can sit in mid-air.
At that moment, Till arrives, praising Van for his hard work and handing him a towel to wipe himself off.
Although the training is extremely harsh, Van enjoys every day since his reincarnation. He states that he never felt this satisfied in his previous life, and intends to continue living in this world to the fullest. Sometime later, the scene shifts to the marketplace. Van explains that he is now 6 years old and has begun to be called a prodigy child. Up to this point, his life has been filled with exhausting study sessions and relentless sword training. Back at home, Van collapses onto his books, completely worn out from studying. Van explains that he does the same things every day and is starting to grow tired of it. If this continues, he feels he will not be able to enjoy his life the way he wanted. He tells Till that he wants to go out and play. Till asks if there is any place he would like to visit, and Van asks to go to the market. The young boy explains that in order to stop being seen as a prodigy and become a normal child, he decided to act a little lazy. Seeing the crowded market amazes him. Till explains that this is the city's main marketplace. Van asks about the large building behind it, and she replies that it belongs to the Mari Company, a major trading company with branches throughout the kingdom. Because of its size, Van compares it to Costco. At that moment, they hear a man shouting and notice a slave child. The man sees Van watching and says that this is not a spectacle. The guards quickly move to draw their swords, but Van stops them and asks the man why the child is tied with a rope. The man replies that the boy is his son and that he can do whatever he wants, explaining that he has come to sell him as a slave. Till explains that poor families sometimes sell children they cannot support, which Van finds deeply disturbing. Soon after, a woman appears and asks if Van is the young lord of the Marquis family. Till confirms this and introduces him as the famous child prodigy. The woman introduces herself as Rosalite and welcomes them to the Mari company. Upon learning that Van belongs to the Marquis family, the old man becomes frightened. Van asks Rosalite about the boy and how much she would be willing to pay. She asks the man about the boy's magical aptitude, and he replies that the boy only has aptitude for stealing. Hearing this, Rosalite states that he is not even worth 3 large silver coins. Enraged, the man begins beating the boy, calling him useless and cruelly pulling on him while ordering him to stand up so they can go to another shop. Unable to watch this injustice any longer, Van declares that he will buy the boy for 5 large silver coins. He asks Till for the money and immediately pays the man without hesitation. As soon as the man receives the money, he runs away, abandoning his son. Van approaches the boy, unties him, and helps him to his feet. He introduces himself by name, and the boy responds by giving his own name as well. Van tells Kam Shin that he is now free to do whatever he wants. Hearing this, Till asks whether Van did not buy him as a slave. Van answers that he only wanted to save him, but since Kam Shin has nowhere to go, he invites him to his home. The guards warn him that his father may not allow it. In that case, Van asks Kam Shin if he would like to come as his slave. Without hesitation, the boy accepts. Rosalite then explains that a slave contract must be completed first. She takes both of their hands and, while chanting a spell, completes the contract, placing a seal on Kam Shin's hand. She also adds that since it is their first visit, she will handle the work for free. Van thanks her, which makes Rosalite nervous. As she guides them toward her shop, she murmurs in amazement that this is the first time a noble has ever thanked her. After some time passes, Kam Shin is shown in much better health, now serving Van. A maid informs him that Vice Commander D is looking for him for sword training. Van asks her not to say anything and rewards her with a cookie. Van notices that Kam Shin is not wearing his gloves, and asks if he is not embarrassed to show his slave mark. Kam Shin replies that it is the opposite, as he wants everyone to see it. Van understands, but reminds him that he gave him those gloves using his own money. Without hesitation, Kam Shin puts them back on. Soon after, they hear D's voice. Kam Shin leaves the room and tells him that his master is not there. D does not believe him and notices crumbs around Kam Shin's mouth, asking what that is. Kam Shin quickly wipes his face but is accused of being bribed. D angrily says that Kam Shin has a lot of nerve to disobey the vice commander of the knights. Kam Shin reminds him that he is Van's slave. D acknowledges his courage for daring to respond. With his weapon burning, he declares that from now on he will train Kam Shin instead of Van. As time passes in the city, people continue talking about the upcoming aptitude test for the protagonist. Everyone expects him to soon become the lord of these lands. At that very moment, a storm breaks out. When it is revealed that young Master Van has no aptitude for any of the 4 elemental magics and only possesses aptitude for production magic, the situation takes a drastic turn. Production magic is considered the most pathetic of all forms of magic. This revelation leaves Van terrified and deeply disappoints the elders. They explain that production magic ranks at the very bottom. It is used to create materials and relies on imagination to form swords or jewelry. But all of that can be done even without magic. They question how Van could possibly protect the people with such a power. His father states that both he and his late wife Mira were extremely powerful fire mages, and finds it impossible that their child could be a production mage. He emphasizes that Van is the last child Mira left behind. At that point, he draws his sword and declares that this has gone far enough. He admits that he was foolish to place all his hopes on Van after seeing his great talent as a child, but never imagined such a disgrace would arise in his own household. He raises his sword. Van is in serious danger and desperately wonders what he can do. At that moment, Marcia steps forward. His father asks what he is doing. Marcia explains that at the border of their marquisate there is a village that has never developed due to its location. He suggests sending Van there. It is a nameless village with barely 100 inhabitants, and no special products. The northern mountains contain resources, but they are inhabited by massive magical beasts. Along one route lies the county of Ferdinand, ruled by Linda, and on the opposite side stands the enemy kingdom of Yelenetta. Marcia explains that the village is mainly used as a temporary military camp and is rarely utilized. The father understands his intention. Since the village is a recently annexed territory, its loyalty is still unstable. Formally sending a member of the family there could eventually help secure and expand their domain. Accepting this reasoning, he sheathes his sword and orders Van to take charge of that village and depart as soon as he is ready. He even praises Mercia for finding a use for someone he considers useless. With that, the elders leave the room. Van narrowly escapes execution. However, the young boy does not understand why Mercia would do him such a favor. At that moment, Mercia kneels before him and says that he could not bear to watch Van suffer. That is why he made such an absurd proposal, adding that Van is free to hate him if he wishes. Van instead thanks him, knowing that without Mercia he would have lost his life. Mercia then asks Van to allow him to do everything within his power to help him, and Van accepts, sealing it with a brotherly handshake. The next morning, Till's shouts can be heard as she defends her young master Van. She declares that even without magic, he is still a wise and admirable noble, and that it is unfair to exile him to a remote village. Van thanks her for her concern, but acknowledges that there is no longer any choice but to leave. He adds that a rural lord should not have to work excessively and will have plenty of free time, declaring that he will turn that village into a place suited to a relaxed and happy life. Soon after, several wagons depart loaded with his belongings. Since no official escort was provided, his brother Mercia hires 10 adventurers to accompany him. Van mentions that at first the journey felt especially cruel as he was only allowed to bring his slave Kamshin, and he expresses gratitude for Mercia's kindness. At that moment, Till arrives, announcing that she is coming with him because she is his personal maid and cares deeply for him. She also declares that she will teach him everything she knows about swordsmanship, even as Van secretly thinks that he wants no more training. Van still cannot believe all of this is happening, recalling that he was told no knights would accompany him. When this is mentioned, Dee pretends not to remember. He then calls his subordinates Arb and Lo, and decides to join the journey as well. In addition, Van's tutor and academic instructor brings forward his retirement, stating that he has already prepared his successor. He wishes to spend the rest of his time supervising Van's education. Although much of Van's family is opposed to this, Van himself is shown smiling. He admits that he is also afraid of crossing the border. Kamshin notices that the carriage does not bear the family crest. Van explains that his father does not want anyone to know that he is sending his son away. However, behind them, the people of the city are gathered to see him off, as the knight had ordered 2 horses to be attached to the carriage, publicly announcing the departure. Van reminds them that his father wanted everything to be discreet, but since Dee fell asleep, nothing can be done and the banners will be removed once he wakes up. Dee is the type who does whatever he wants, but he is well liked. Thus, the city announces the farewell of Van Nefertio, the 4th son of the Marquis, as he sets off on his journey. After leaving the city, Van grows emotional, leaning out of the carriage window to say goodbye and thank everyone. During the journey, Van is seen practicing with his ability. He transforms a branch into a tiny sword. Kamshin asks if that is production magic, and Van confirms it. He explains that he plans to test it little by little, though he still has not found a proper use for it. After some time passes, Till announces that they are about to arrive. This excites Van. He tells Kamshin that if he ever grows tired of the place, he can return to the Marquis, since the slave contract can apparently be annulled. If he goes with his brother Mercia, he would surely be taken care of. Kamshin refuses, stating that he swore to dedicate his life to Van and to risk it if necessary. Van blushes at these words and jokingly wonders if that counts as a declaration. Suddenly, the carriage comes to an abrupt stop. Van asks what is happening outside. The red-haired man warns them that the village is under attack. Following this, Van calls for an emergency meeting. Seeing that the bandits are experienced fighters, he assumes that the fence surrounding the village is useless against arrows. Comparing the number of people on both sides, he doubts they can win through numbers alone. Even so, he proposes that everyone attack together, believing this is the only way to stop the assault. However, the leader of the adventurers questions this decision, judging it far too risky and unwilling to let his men die. Van explains that this is his first domain, and that the villagers are his subjects. If he does not draw his sword in a crisis like this, he does not know when he ever should. The adventurer acknowledges Van's knightly spirit but emphasizes that such ideals do not apply to adventurers. Seeing no other option, he asks the leader to at least protect Van and retreat if necessary. At that moment, Esparta intervenes and strongly opposes the idea. He states that if the village is destroyed, it will have no future even if Van survives to govern it. He adds that although he is old, he is a 4-element mage, and they can rely on him in battle. Taking command, Esparta explains his plan. He will first raise a defensive wall. The adventurers will then attack from the rear at long range, and once the enemy focuses on them, Esparta and his men will strike from the flanks. By combining surprise attacks, they can secure victory. Van then asks whether they truly intend to stay and fight. Esparta, acting as the head butler, answers that of course he will do it, since if he does not attack from the wall, he and his men will die in vain. Van refuses to allow that. Esparta then asks him to at least allow him and his old bones to have their moment of glory just this once. Even so, Van refuses to lose them. He knows that without their help, he would never be able to develop the domain. Without hesitation, Van declares that he will act as the decoy. Hearing this, Till immediately offers to do it instead, and Kam Shin also volunteers. Van stops them both. He tells Till that he does not want to lose those he cares about, and reminds Kam Shin that he is now free and should live his life. Because of this, Van comes up with another plan. He explains that he will charge straight at the enemy using the carriage. While the enemy focuses on him, the others will attack from the flanks and from a distance. D questions this plan, but Van reminds him that he trains in swordsmanship every day with the vice commander of the knights, so he will not be defeated easily. He draws his sword and declares that even if he dies, it would be an honor to give his life for his subjects. His only request is that his body be abandoned afterward, so it will not bring trouble to his family. Seeing this level of determination, the captain of the adventurers recalls a previous conversation with his companions. He had always claimed that nobles were arrogant and despicable people who mistreated commoners and adventurers alike. However, after meeting Van, who treated him with respect and courtesy at all times, he is forced to question his own prejudice. Returning to the present, the captain approaches Van and accepts the plan, stating that just this once, they will entrust their lives to him. Van replies that it is not necessary, but the captain insists that he cannot ignore a situation where a child is prepared to die, as his companions would never forgive him otherwise. At that moment, the adventurer's mage expresses her astonishment. She states that she has never seen a noble willing to risk his life so resolutely for his subjects, as every noble she has known before only spoke empty words. This surprises Van, who calls the mage by her name Puriel. Hearing this, she admits that she likes him, as he even remembers their names. Because of that, she feels she can entrust her life to him. D then steps forward, declaring that as knights in service to the Marquis's house, protecting Lord Van means protecting the future of the family. After this, Esparta refuses to allow such an irresponsible plan. He reminds Van that once the battle is over, he will teach him the true weight of being an heir. With that said, Esparta announces that he will modify the plan. He explains that he will first raise a defensive wall and that they will attack from a distance, advancing from both the left and the right. Everyone responds in agreement and immediately begins executing the plan. The knights are shocked to realize that Esparta is far more than a simple butler. His earth magic proves extremely powerful as he raises multiple massive walls. One of the knights comments that if they had rejected Van's request, he himself would have risked his life in Van's place, as he has grown very fond of the boy. Both of them express satisfaction with Van's conduct and hope that one day he might even become king. Inside the walls, numerous archers fire their arrows, determined to seize the village, when suddenly arrows rain down on them from behind. No one understands where the attack is coming from until they spot an opening at the rear, where Puriel appears accompanied by 2 archers. The bandit leader orders his men to attack them, but D charges in, striking down several enemies. Others arrive as well, cutting down more bandits. The plan proceeds perfectly. With the enemy distracted, the remaining knights and adventurers enter the battlefield. A blonde companion, despite his chubby build, cuts through several foes with incredible speed, mocking them for being slow. Arb and Lo also fight fiercely, while D advances with an intimidating aura that spreads fear. The bandits begin to panic, including their leader. The leader attempts to escape through the rear to attack those positioned there. He is about to take Puriel's life, but Van arrives and delivers a clean, elegant slash to the man's legs, sending him crashing to the ground. Kam Shin immediately follows up, finishing him with a powerful strike to the chest. It is a perfect display of teamwork. Van then warns that the enemy may regroup and focus their attack on that position, telling them to remain alert at the front. These words leave Puriel deeply astonished, making her wonder who this young boy truly is. After the battle ends, it is stated that they managed to suppress the enemy without suffering any casualties, achieving the best possible outcome. With that, only the payment remains to complete the request. At that moment, the purple-haired mage Puriel asks if something is wrong. He simply answers that he feels a bit curious, and everyone assumes that this curiosity is related to the boy Van. He confirms it and makes them a proposal. Although they would not earn much money, he considers staying in this place. This makes everyone pause and think. One of them apologizes, explaining that they already have another request to fulfill. He tells them not to worry and expresses his hope that they will meet again. Thus, they part ways with the rest of the adventurers. However, Puriel decides to stay behind, saying that Van saved her life and that she must repay the favor. The others who remain comment in amazement that he is only 10 years old. Everyone agrees, adding that he is the only noble they actually like. They all become eager to see what kind of domain the young Van will build, and decide to help him for a while longer. At that moment, Till scolds Van for putting himself in danger, and the protagonist apologizes. Soon after, Dee arrives, declaring that the victory was magnificent and praising Van for his efforts. Esparta then approaches and informs them that the villagers have gathered at the entrance. Van thanks him and, walking toward the gate, states that it is time for his introduction. As they enter, they notice that the village is large, but the people look exhausted and extremely thin from hunger. Here they meet Rhonda, the village chief, who thanks them for saving the village this time. Van becomes confused and asks whether this has happened before. Rhonda confirms this and explains that the reason is that the village previously belonged to Count Ferdinand, whose knights regularly patrolled the area. However, that protection ended after the land came under Marquis Fertio. Upon learning this, Van apologizes on behalf of his father. He explains that his father is still unaware of the situation in small villages. Rhonda then asks if this means that because they do not pay much in taxes, they are not worth protecting. Van responds that complaining alone will solve nothing. This angers one of the villagers, but Van clarifies that he is speaking about the future of the village. While nobles bear great responsibility, the true problem lies in the laws imposed by the royal Belrinet family. Those laws cannot be changed right now, so the only option is to find solutions within the current system. Van proposes 3 concrete measures. First, to give the village value that the kingdom cannot ignore. Second, to earn money and hire mercenaries. Third, to remodel and develop the village itself. A woman intervenes, saying that they had thought of such ideas before, but that they are extremely difficult to achieve. Van reassures her, saying that they now have him as their new lord. The villagers are not immediately convinced. To support Van, Esparta steps forward and introduces himself as the former chief butler of the Marquis' household, declaring that Van is a genius. Dee also steps forward, identifying himself as the vice commander of the Fertio Knights. This excites Chief Rhonda, who asks Van if this means he can wield all 4 elements. Van clarifies that he only has aptitude for production magic. Hearing this, the villagers' expressions shift from hope to deep disappointment, since production magic is considered the weakest of all. This also discourages Van himself. At that moment, a villager asks about taxes, explaining that they were previously forced to give up 30% of their harvest. Van announces that the tax will be reduced to 10% for a period of time. This brings great relief to the villagers. With that settled, Van suggests beginning work on reinforcing the village walls. He asks Esparta whether his earth magic structures last over time. Esparta explains that they remain solid as long as mana continues to flow through them, but once the mana runs out, they revert to ordinary earth. Van considers this sufficient and orders temporary walls to be erected. Everyone is shocked as massive walls rise in mere seconds. Afterward, Van also requests the construction of a moat to slow down future invaders. The knights immediately volunteer to handle this task. Not only that, they will also prepare traps and pits. Van finds this excellent, and turning to the villagers, he tells them that their cooperation will be essential for the village to be reborn stronger than ever. After this, the young lord says that he wants to test his production magic. He takes part of a tree trunk and begins to concentrate. He slowly draws heat from deep within his stomach, sends his mana to the tips of his fingers, and visualizes each individual fiber of the wood. He carefully weaves them together like a rope, knowing that the finer the fibers, the more solid a wooden block he can create. Till and the others ask what he has just produced. Van replies that it is a fiber block, something similar to nanofiber, a term they do not understand, which causes them to make confused expressions. After some time passes, Dee comes by and examines the blocks Van created. He picks one up and remarks that it is very light yet extremely hard. He asks for permission to cut it. Van allows it, but when Dee tries to slice it, he only manages to knock it far away. The cube remains completely intact but crashes into and damages a tree. Everyone is stunned by this result. Even more surprising is the fact that Dee struck it with enough force to split a rock, meaning that Van achieved exactly what he intended. After several hours, Van is shown having created even more cubes, along with weapons. Someone asks whether his mana has not yet been exhausted, but Van replies that he still does not feel any strain. He explains that production magic normally consumes so much mana that creating even a single item is difficult, which is why it is considered a useless form of magic. Out of pure curiosity, Van creates a katana. Seeing how fascinated Kam Shin is by it, Van gives it to him. He then notices that Till also seems to be expecting something. Understanding this without words, he gives her an axe instead. Van then wonders, based on her strange expression, whether she does not like axes. Till pretends and says that it is a very magnificent axe, explaining that she was simply mesmerized while looking at it. Van is glad that she likes it, but after examining it more closely, he decides that next time he will make an even nicer accessory for her. That night, Van goes to rest. He mentions that his entire body hurts from sleeping outdoors throughout the journey. He also feels dirty from not being able to bathe. He knows that Till and Kam Shin are pretending to be fine, but he is certain they are just as exhausted as he is. Because of this, before strengthening the village's defenses, he realizes that he must first secure their basic needs. He makes a decision, and that decision is to build a house. The next day, everyone wakes up. The villagers notice the blocks Van gathered and ask what they are. Van then asks if they would mind if he built a house in that area. An elderly man replies that the plaza has barely been used lately, so it would be an ideal and perfect location for their lord's residence. Van thanks him and quietly thinks that once things are more stable, he will organize festivals and carnivals there. Van then focuses on constructing the house, visualizing every necessary part in his mind, from the pillars and supports embedded in the ground to the walls and the roof. He extends his magic, and in just a few seconds a mansion rises into existence. Everyone witnesses this and is left in complete amazement at the house he has built. They praise him endlessly, left completely speechless. Van is happy that his production magic has proven useful to everyone, though in all honesty the size of the house may have gone a little too far. Just a little. After finishing the massive mansion, Van mentions that his production magic is more suitable for a feudal lord than the magic of the four elements. While he finds it interesting, he knows that offensive magic is better for protecting people. That way, everyone can live more peacefully. Till and Kamin thinks the same, but Sparta says that in times of war, he would be right. However, for people who want to improve their lives, Van understands them better. That is proven by the fact that he even built a house. They also know that Van's magic is far beyond normal, so Van offers to build them a house if they bring more wood. They do not waste this opportunity and immediately order their team to bring more wood. Then, the village elder asks Van if he could also build houses for the villagers, since the wind and rain are so strong that everything gets flooded and their small houses are already in poor condition. From what we see, he was right. Van would love to do it, but building many houses at once would be exhausting. Still, after seeing the condition of their homes, he decides to start by changing the village layout, even though it means some people will temporarily have no houses. Even so, they choose to help him because they know Van is right. In this way, Van decides to make the people happy using his production magic, and we see him remodel the houses. Tillin proudly shows how a house that was once unlivable became bright and sturdy. Everyone is amazed by Van's massive amount of mana, as well as his high-level architectural sense. Van explains that the design uses a grid system, where 4 houses are grouped into one block and arranged so that the main roads form a network. He also made all the houses identical to avoid inequality. For now, these houses are temporary, but once he obtains high-quality stone, he will improve each one to better suit the families. He also tells them that he built simple bathrooms next to the mansion, which makes the women very happy. Van, however, only thought of them as places to bathe, revealing in his mind that bathrooms were the easiest thing for him to make, since they were something he enjoyed the most in his previous life. He asked Pariel to fill the baths using water magic and Kashi to heat the water with firewood. In short, they are traditional baths and everything is peaceful, until Tilly and Pluriel invite Van to bathe with them. Van refuses, saying he is already too old for that. While the 2 women bathe, Pluriel mentions how Van gave the same luxury to the villagers, calling him an incredible and rare kind of noble. She gets emotional and takes the chance to talk about how amazing Van is, telling stories about how he was already skilled in swordsmanship and studies at just 2 years old, and she goes on talking about his entire life, from childhood until now. Poor Pluriel. At night, Van is enjoying a shower when Kamshin looks at his body and asks if he has gained muscle. The purple-haired man cannot believe it, saying Van looks thinner than D. Van replies that it is obvious, because next to that guy, everyone looks thin. Kamshin promises to keep training to become like Lord D, but Van asks him not to. Just then, D and his companions appear. Van tries to escape the situation, but D stops him and forces him to enjoy time with his friends. After that, Van returns to his room, lies down on his bed, and falls completely asleep. The next day, they inspect everything. Kami reports that the knights have finished the moat. Van is pleased, but recommends filling it with water. After all, they can also use it for drinking and bathing. With that idea in mind, they ask Sparta for help. Using his magic, he diverted water from a nearby river, while Kamen and the others dug by hand. In the end, Van supported them by reinforcing the ground and the walls. Watching everyone work together, Van thinks about how fun it is to do something as a group with the same goal. Since this is necessary for the village to progress, he hopes they will finish in just 1 week. By late afternoon, the workers inform Van that he can already see the village. This surprises him, but he decides to stop for now. Dee tries to convince him to continue, saying they could reach the village in just a few more hours. Van refuses, pointing at Kamshin and his companions and asking Dee to show mercy. With no choice, Dee agrees to stop, though he says he thought he had finally found a new form of training. Yes, for the strong Dee, this was only a warm-up. Van is shocked to see that Dee still has so much strength and energy left. Not only that, Sparta also looks a bit disappointed that they are not continuing. Truly, both of them are legendary workers. The next day, they finally reach the river. Van gathers the knights to thank them for their great effort in finishing the work, knowing they must have suffered doing it. After that, he orders Sparta to let the water flow, breaking the wall and allowing the river to move again. Everyone applauds as the water flows smoothly and reaches the village. The villagers watch in amazement as the water finally surrounds the entire area. When Van arrives, he notices that the water is close to overflowing and could rise even more when it rains. This gives him the idea of creating a lake behind the village. He thinks it is a brilliant idea because using a lake as a water reserve would help them during droughts, so they decide to do it. Once it is finished, Tilamshi comments that for a village that once had no water, even a lake can serve as a reservoir. Now they no longer have to worry about running water. As the people watch this, the old man thanks Van because after so long, they no longer need to walk all the way to the river to get water. Van says there is no need to thank him because it also makes him very happy to see the water reach the village, and now the villagers can live peacefully. In another scene, we see a blonde woman and a girl named Arut inside a carriage. As Arut has just woken up, the blonde gently pats her head. For the girl, Panamera, it feels nice, but she scolds Harut, calling her that for touching the head of an unmarried lady, and pats her head even harder. Panamera mentions that there is still a long way to go before reaching the border village, so she tells her to rest for now. Back at the village, we see how Van has reinforced the walls. He even added a gate. What was once a wall of dirt is now made of concrete. They realize he achieved this by mixing earth and stone, making it impossible for bandits to break through such a strong wall. Still, he decides that this is not enough security, so he installs ballistas on top of the walls, equipped with front shields so they can fire while staying protected. Till is amazed that Van's production magic can create almost anything. Even though the village is small, it already looks like a fortified city. In Dee's words, it looks more like a small fortress. He says that no bandit will ever be able to get through. Then he brings up something interesting, wondering what would have happened if Lord Halpa, Van's father, had realized Van's power before casting him out. He knows that the Marchese would have prospered with Van's help. Sparta suggests that he should not call it that, saying Van simply prioritized defensive power. But for Dee, this cannot be ignored. Van's power can also be used to fight, not just to defend. It is superior to anyone else's. However, Sparta maintains his stance, saying Van's power is defensive in nature and not meant for invading other countries. This discussion is stopped by Van himself, saying that there is no point in regretting fate or talent because he will simply do what he needs to do. This makes Dee laugh, saying that complaining is useless anyway, though Sparta teases him by asking if he wants Van to rebel against the Marquisate. Just then, Van's stomach starts to growl. After Tiles finishes preparing the food, Esparta talks about the village's income. He explains that only one merchant comes by each month. Van says that for now, he can handle the materials himself, and the village's crops are enough. However, Esparta adds that they do not have the ingredients needed to make the sweets Van likes, which worries him. So Van asks for ideas to start a business in the village. Kamen suggests selling materials, and Till proposes hunting animals, but both ideas are rejected. One depends too much on Van, and the other on the knights. Because of that, we now see them in the forest. Sarah complains that it seems Tilly and Kamen love the gifts Van gave them so much that they refuse to get them dirty. Van gets annoyed, but they explain that the items are family treasures. Hearing this, Van thanks them for valuing his gifts so much, but reminds them that they must use them to protect themselves. At that moment, Sarah takes out a shield that is supposedly very tough. Van asks Kamshin to try hitting it, holding back out of concern. Kamshin does so, but the hit is weak. Sarah then tells him to hit it seriously. As she says this, she hears something fall to the ground. She turns around and sees a broken piece of the shield. Realizing this, she starts crying, saying she had not even used it yet. Van calms her down, uses his magic, and repairs the shield. Sarah is surprised to see that it now looks brand new. Suddenly, someone asks Van for a moment. Approaching the minerals, he asks if Van would be willing to buy all of them. He explains that in the forest at the foot of the Wolfbrook Mountains, there are many dangerous magical beasts, which might be why they can extract rare minerals without climbing the mountain. He shows that they have iron, copper, silver, gold, and even mithril. Van is shocked and asks why no one mined these minerals before. The man says this is only a guess, but it might be because the area is far away and hard to access, so knights only come to explore. From this, Van understands that if these minerals are here, the mountain range must be full of resources. He asks if he can use the iron ore, and they allow it. We then see Van use his magic to shape it into a cube. He explains that although he melted it, he did not remove all the impurities, so he is not sure how pure it is. Sarah's chubby companion is amazed and asks Van if he could make swords for them. Van agrees without hesitation. Sarah asks for one short sword and one long sword. Van immediately starts working. He focuses on the thickness and compresses the metal as much as possible. After several seconds, he creates a short sword. The chubby man is clearly impressed. Next, Van moves on to the long sword, following the same process. After a few seconds, it is finished. Seeing the blade and the handle, Sarah shouts with excitement. The others also ask Van to make swords for them. Van gets nervous but agrees since they provided the materials, while the rest argue about who should go first. Pluriel examines the sword and says it could easily be sold for a high price. Van is surprised by this. Around that time, someone points out the mithril, saying it is strange to find it in the forest, as it could mean there is a dungeon nearby. They explain how important that would be, because if a dungeon exists, the village would attract many people and goods. They add that dungeons are sources of national treasures, such as jewels and relics, and by protocol, when a new dungeon is reported, the guild sets up a branch in the nearest village. Van is unsure if it is a good idea to report it right now, since he does not yet have what is needed to host the guild staff. He also worries that a neighboring country might invade to seize the treasure. Pluriel, confused, asks if soldiers would not be sent to protect them, and they confirm that they would. Van then confesses that he is just a burden to the Ferteo family, so if they see the place has value, they would quickly remove him and send him elsewhere. Because of this, Pluriel suggests discovering the dungeon only after Van has made the village prosper, so it would be much harder for the Ferteos to interfere. After this discussion, the leader orders his men to avoid the dungeon area while gathering resources. Seeing them do this for his sake, Van thanks them deeply. On the way back to the village, Van and Dill are walking through the streets when a villager comes running, shouting that a stampede of armored lizards is approaching. Van immediately orders them to raise the bridge and close the gate. The villagers do so and wait in fear behind the defenses, hoping the creatures will not cross the moat. Taking on the role of leader, Van stands firm and tells them that he understands their fear and their reluctance to fight. That is why they will all fight together. He knows he cannot protect them alone, so he needs their help. With strong determination, he asks everyone to lend their strength to protect the village, which is also their home. Upon hearing this, all the villagers agree. Van thanks them and asks everyone to go to the walls. So they all rush to take their positions. Kamshin then informs him that Underscore and his group left their house and are not in the village. Knowing this, Van decides to go to the front lines. However, T stops him without saying a word. Her tears are enough for him to understand. At that moment, D approaches and asks what is going on. Van kindly asks him if he could go up and report the situation, while Van gives the orders from below. D agrees and runs ahead. From the top, he spots the enemies. Van quickly asks how many armored lizards there are. D replies that there are about 40, each at least 8 meters long. This shocks Van. D thinks to himself that not even a group of veteran knights could defeat just one of those creatures, so he wonders what strategy Van has in mind. Van then orders them to load the ballistas with iron arrows. D accepts the order. One of the subordinates points out that normal weapons cannot pierce the lizard's armored scales. D knows this well, but he has survived battles that seemed hopeless before. Today, he chooses to trust young Lord Van's command. With a firm voice, he orders everyone to load the iron arrows into the ballistas. The villagers do so. Without hesitation, they are ordered to fire. When the arrows hit the lizards, it looks as if the arrows disappear. But in reality, they pierce straight through, taking down 10 lizards at once. The villagers cheer, while D remains stunned. However, there is now a problem. Only one iron arrow remains per ballista. Since the monsters keep advancing, they reload and fire again. The second volley wipes out another wave, but more are still coming. They start thinking about what to do next, until Van remembers something. He orders them to use wooden arrows. A red-haired man says that wooden arrows cannot possibly pierce the lizards, but D decides to trust Lord Van again. After all, Van has always exceeded expectations. He protected the village and developed it to an unbelievable level. Because of that, he chooses to believe in him. The ballistas are loaded with wooden arrows and fired. Amazingly, the arrows sink into the monsters' heads, wiping out the third wave. Everyone is shocked and overjoyed, already talking about eating lizard skewers. Now confident, they reload and fire again. Finishing off the rest, D shouts that they have won, and the entire village celebrates. Even Van feels relieved that his plan worked. Winning without a single injury leaves D speechless, and he says that Van will go far beyond what anyone can imagine. After the battle, they begin collecting the lizard parts, scales, skin, and meat. Ordo thinks there are too many lizards, so much that the meat might rot before they can cook it all. Just then, Ban arrives, amazed at how much meat they gathered, and suggests holding a meat festival to celebrate their great victory. The entire village eats and drinks together, happy to share food and laughter. All of this is thanks to Papa Van. An elder tells the old man that he has never known a noble who laughs together with common people like them. Esparta comments that Van's behavior is unusual, but at the same time it has its own charm. While Van is eating, mentions that he realized Van's plan, that the arrows were made of the same material as the weapons Van crafted earlier. D overhears this and becomes jealous that Van made weapons for the adventurers, but not for him. The Ender team proudly shows off their weapons, praising their sharpness, lightness, and how amazing they look. Because of this, D's team also asks Van to make weapons for them, offering to pay whatever it costs. Van refuses to take money, but asks them to bring the materials instead. Later, once things calm down, Van mentions that they could sell the meat for a large amount of money. However, since much of it would spoil during transport, after deductions they would each earn about 8 gold coins. He quickly does the math in his head. Since they defeated 40 lizards, that would be about 300 gold coins in total, an amount that, in terms of his previous world, would be worth over 300 million yen. Yes, it is a huge amount of money. Van is happy about it, but Esparta quickly brings him back to reality, reminding him that the law says if a settlement earns more than 100 gold coins, half of it must be paid as tax to the Marquis. Van asks if they could keep it a secret, but Esparta knows it would be impossible to hide that much money. This worries Van, especially because if his father finds out what is happening in the village, he might be sent to an even more remote place. Sparta then adds that while keeping it secret is difficult, it is not impossible. He suggests reporting the profits under his older brother Mercia. Van understands the plan. The credit would go to Mercia, and no one would be harmed. He also remembers that Mercia needs achievements, so both of them would benefit. The next day, merchants arrive at the village. They look confused, wondering if this really is the border village. At that moment, Van approaches them and introduces himself as the lord of the village. He politely asks them to identify themselves. The merchants comply. The driver introduces himself as Bell, the older brother, and his younger brother, Rango. Both belong to the Mary Company. Knowing this, Van lets them enter. Inside the warehouse, the merchants are left speechless when they see the massive amount of armored lizard materials. Van asks if they are willing to buy them. Bell answers yes and says he will immediately gather his staff, though it will take a month to transport everything. Van agrees and even offers the meat for free, but in exchange he asks them to take a look at his high-quality weapons. The brothers agree. When they examine the swords, they are amazed by the craftsmanship. They tell Van that they are willing to pay any price he asks, which pleases him. Van then asks them to help promote the weapons. The brothers hesitate at this request, but Van quickly realizes that they are planning to monopolize the sales. He points out that if the only two merchants on the same route sell weapons at the same time, everyone will know they come from this village. In other words, he indirectly calls them out. He then says that it would be better to announce it openly from the start and create a system where everyone earns more as sales increase. Van asks how they can do that, and he answers by saying they will open a shop in the village. The brothers are delighted and thank him for giving them that opportunity. Without wasting time, Van suggests starting the construction immediately. Just minutes later, a building appears, leaving the brothers stunned by something so extraordinary. Bell is especially shocked, since he had only just explained what his ideal shop would look like. Nearby, we see a silver-haired girl and a blonde woman at the entrance of the village. The blonde woman confidently says that she will personally confirm whether the rumors about the prodigy child are true. Back in Van's office, while he is talking and planning the village layout and its defenses with Esparta, a soldier interrupts to announce that an emissary from the neighboring county of Ferdinand has arrived. Van allows them to enter. The emissary turns out to be the blonde woman accompanied by the young girl. Van introduces himself as the lord of the village. The emissary introduces herself as Panamera Carla Cayenne, newly appointed viscountess, proudly stating that she rose from the rank of knight. The girl is Arut and Ferdinand, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinand. Van thanks them for coming to such a humble village and invites them to sit. Panamera notes that Van is younger than Arut, yet has a strong presence. She asks if he has any idea why they came. Van replies that it is likely to evaluate him and earn his trust. Panamera laughs, saying he is correct. She explains that the Count does not trust Van and that the lord in charge of the border with Yeleneta fears Van may be a tool of the Marquise's excessive ambition. She also assumes that Van was expelled from his home for lacking the 4 elements. Van confirms that secret but clarifies that her other concerns are false, as his father simply cast him out. Panamera finds this hard to believe, because in such a short time, this simple village now has walls and very modern structures. She estimates that at least 5,000 subordinates must have been sent to build everything, with the goal of turning it into a new military base. Here, Van is left speechless, but then he starts laughing, saying that their serious faces are making him feel even more uncomfortable. He tells her not to worry, and that he will explain the misunderstanding. He explains that his father only allowed him to take Kamshin and whatever luggage he could carry, and that he left without saying goodbye to his family. Everyone else came by their own choice. Dee interrupts and adds that he followed Van because of his sword talent and great potential. Even though the knight captain ordered him to return, he chose to leave anyway. Esparta then says that he is already old, but he wanted to continue educating Van, so he announced his retirement and came with him to spend his remaining years passing on his knowledge. Till says that Van treats everyone equally. He is a good person, and that is why she wants to serve him forever. All of this leaves Panamera and Arut speechless. Still, Panamera asks how such a drastic change happened in the village. To explain it, Van asks them to go outside. Once there, Van says he will begin. First, Sparta raises a wall of earth. Seeing this, Panamera is amazed that he is not just a simple butler, but actually a first-class mage of the 4 elements. However, Sparta explains that once his magic runs out, the wall would collapse on its own. That is when Van steps in, transforming the wall into a solid structure and using cubes to create a door, completing the construction in just a few seconds. Panamera cannot believe it. Arut asks Van what kind of magic he has, while Panamera remains in shock. Van replies that he has the most useless magic in the world, production magic. Hearing this, the young girl recalls her past. Van continues explaining how he was kicked out of his home as soon as his aptitude was discovered, which means his father does not know the true potential of his power. Panamera finds this absurd, believing that with such power, the Marquis could greatly expand his influence. Aside from that, Panamera reveals that she was actually sent to assess a possible engagement between Van and Arut. In his mind, Van understands that this is meant to prevent possible hostilities. He then clarifies that he only intends to keep developing the village and has no desire to seek conflict with anyone, so he does not think an engagement is necessary. Panamera admits that she was originally against the engagement, since Van was a child exiled to the border, and whether he was capable or not, she believed Arut would end up unhappy. Van agrees with her point of view. However, Panamera says that after seeing his behavior, how he treats his subordinates, and his power, She has changed her mind. She even says that if they were the same age, she would offer herself as a candidate. Yes, the bold blonde aiming much younger. Van takes this as a compliment and feels happy. Panamera then asks Arut what she thinks and whether she wants to accept the engagement. The young girl admits that Van is a good person, but she is still unsure. Van supports her, saying that he is also not at the age to think about such things and suggests taking it slow. Panamera agrees. She then says they will stay the night and wait until the next day for her answer. Van is surprised to hear this. Panamera laughs and says that it is the first time she has seen Van act like an actual child. Putting the jokes aside, she tells Arut that if they are going to stay, they can lodge at Van's residence. Hearing this, the young girl gets nervous and blurts out that she cannot sleep in a man's room. Panamera laughs and asks Van if he has guest rooms. Van replies that he does not, but tells her not to worry because he can make one instantly. A few minutes later, Panamera and Arut see the inn Van created, leaving them both stunned. That night, they all have dinner together. Van asks the young girl if she likes the food, and Arut replies that it is very delicious. Van takes the chance to make conversation and asks what she likes. The girl answers that she likes pretty things, such as flowers and dolls. Van asks her to show him some of those one day. Arut agrees and adds that she brought several dolls in her carriage and could show them the next day. Van thanks her, which makes Arut's heart flutter. At that moment, Kamshin and the others also ask to see the dolls, and Arut agrees without any trouble, making everyone happy. After finishing dinner and getting ready to sleep, Panamera says she is very sleepy and excuses herself, leaving the two children alone. In the quiet moment, Van asks Arut if something is bothering her. Gathering her courage, Arut thanks him for everything. She says she was very nervous because she thought she might be forced into an engagement, but now she feels calmer knowing how kind he is. Blushing deeply, she runs off while saying goodbye to Van. Later, Sparta tells Van that if the Count's family sent Lady Arut for an engagement, it might be because she lacks aptitude for the four elements. Van understands, knowing how painful it is to be cast out of one's home like that. Still, he says that he wants to respect Arut's wishes. If she cannot return home, she can stay in the village without needing to marry him, and if she ever wants to go back, they will help her. Now we move to Arut arriving at the inn. Panamera greets her and asks if she confessed. A very embarrassed Arut answers no. Panamera then says that although she planned to return the next day, she is now considering staying a few more days. She asks Arut what she thinks, and the girl says she agrees. That night, before going to sleep, Arut decides that she will start a conversation with Van the next time they meet. She admits she feels very excited for the next day, and with that thought, the young girl closes her eyes.